Thank you for joining us today for another exclusive interview sponsored by Immovet. Help your horses reach their maximal potential with Immovet's line of natural homeopathic products. I'm your host today, Aurelian Germinal. Today, we are thrilled to have Jamie Walter, the mastermind behind ProvenThoroughbreds. With a wealth of experience in the racing industry, Jamie has been instrumental in the success of numerous race horses, including standout performers like Think About It and Private Eye. We'll dive into the art of racehorse syndication, the nuance of managing a successful stable, and Jamie's insight on navigating the competitive landscape of Australian racing. Stay tuned for an inspiring and insightful conversation. So first of all, Jamie, great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Aurelian. This feels like deja vu.
I know. We had that last year, I believe.
Indeed, and let's hope we have the same outcome.
Let's hope so, for sure, definitely. That was quite amazing.
Yes, no, it was a thrilling day last year.
I can imagine, yeah. So after this incredible success, of Think About It and Private Eye in the 2023 Everest, what are your expectations now and preparation for these horses in the 2024 race?
Well, both are back in work. Private Eye is slightly ahead of Think About It, so he's likely to have perhaps 2 lead-up runs to the Everest, all going well, and Think About It will probably only have the 1 run. However, when I'm talking about setting both horses for the Everest, as you know, the Everest is a slot race, and Proven Thoroughbreds, our company, doesn't hold a slot. So we have to be offered a slot by one of the dozen slot holders. At this stage, there's no offer on the table, Aurelian. Okay. So both horses have to earn their spot, for want of a better term. Have found over the years that not having a slot, when I say over the years, we've only been in a couple of Everests, but having watched the progress of this young race quite closely, it's only 6 or 7 years old, the initial tendency from slot holders was to dive in and get a horse as quickly as possible. Then they started to get a little bit more selective and tried to finesse, so they would invariably get horses late. So in 2022, for example, Giga Kick, who won, and Private Eye, who ran second, were the 2 last selected horses.
Oh, wow.
So that gave confidence to the slot holders that waiting and seeing what form is exposed close to the race is a pretty good strategy for giving yourself the best chance of gagging the winner.
Excellent. How does Joe plan to manage the training, specifically, and maybe race schedule? Well, you said it's a bit complicated until then, for Think About It and Private Eye, leading up to that 2024 Everest.
Well, Joe's very experienced now. He's had runners in the Everest before these 2. So he's had Eduardo raced in a couple of Everests. So he's got a sort of standard way of preparing the horses. I mean, they're all individuals. Some of them require slightly different training methods. And Private Eye and Think About It are 2 vastly different personalities. One's a high energy horse, Think About It, and Private Eye's very laid back. But on race day, they're both high level performers. So in terms of the preparation, he's just going to train them as if they're being prepared for the race. And if we don't get a slot because their first up runs don't warrant it, then we'll end up in the consolation, I guess.
Fair enough. But at least there is preparation, well, of course, ahead. It needs to be.
Yes. Indeed, yes.
You've mentioned previously that Private Eye performs better in spring How does this influence your strategy for the upcoming Everest?
Well, he's performed really well in the last few springs and not so well in the autumn. Now, historically, in the autumn, as you would know, having spent a bit of time in Sydney, Aurelian, um, autumns in Sydney can be very damp and humid. So we get a lot of rain-affected tracks. And whilst Private Eye was successful on those sort of tracks when he was a younger horse coming through his grades, once he's reached this top level, like nearly all horses, they develop a preference for one type of going or the other. And he clearly prefers firm ground to soft ground. So that's compromised his last few autumns, I think.
Okay.
And we've had a bit of bad luck too, and probably a bit of pilot error. And this same thing applies to Think About It, who had a forgettable autumn as well. So we're hoping that in the spring sunshine and firmer tracks that both horses can regain their best form.
That sounds good. Could you tell us a little bit more about any changes or maybe improvement that you have, suggested to Joe or heard from him? Maybe about tweaking in your approach to the Everest this year, based on your experiences back from 2023.
Probably not. I mean, Joe's a very experienced trainer, as I mentioned,
Sure.
and he's excels at setting horses for specific days.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of tweaking, look, there's not much to tweak because he's very familiar with how to bring both horses to their top. Perfect. At this time of year for this sort of race. Mm-hmm. The only thing that needs to be established are the jockeys for those horses, and that'll be finalised in the next few weeks.
Okay, very well. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the attention that you get, especially with the success of Think About It and Private Eye. How do you balance that attention and, resources given to your emerging talents like maybe the Black Cloud or In Flight?
Well, we've had a bit of luck over the winter with horses like the Black Cloud and In Flight emerging. They're a long way short of Everest class at the moment, but they're young and promising and both have a lot of ability. So who knows if they keep developing in the future. One of Joe's great virtues as a trainer is his capacity to develop these horses and not pressure them too much when they're younger. So you tend to see them peak as they get older. And the two fillies you've just quoted have just turned 4. Well, they're mares now, I beg your pardon. The Black Cloud will be running in a stakes race at the end of this month. And whilst she raced over the winter, we won't be giving her a very taxing spring this year. It's a bit hard to assess where they sit class-wise until they have more racing.
That is a bit tricky, yeah. So, at the moment, they're still very young, like you mentioned, 4-year-old, right?
And lightly raced too,
Sure.
In Flight's won 5 from 10. The Black Cloud's won 4 from 6. Good records, but to get to the top level, you've got to keep improving. And the bar's raised each time you go up in class. And as a great old saying, many are called and few are chosen, Aurelian. I've had plenty of horses who've won 4 from 6 and 5 from 10 who don't graduate to that level. So we'll have to see what the future lies for them.
It is a lot of, like I mentioned before, a team effort as well, like you mentioned also, with Joe. So it's very often about the horse, but also the people around, and that, affect that a lot.
Yeah. Managing owners is our job as syndicators, and we've got large groups of owners, 20, 30 odd in both horses. And there's some gentle rivalry between them, referring to the others. Think about it in private eye, because the two obviously clash from time to time, and they did clash in the spring. So yeah, the owner expectation is where we have to use our experience to manage that, because I often tell people, Aurelian, my job really is a manager of disappointment, because so many horses disappoint rather than thrill.
Well, that's a
And
tricky. It is a tricky business for sure.
so in a results-based business like this,
Sure,
you've got
that's true.
to be very
Especially
mindful of keeping expectations realistic.
true, true. Well, you've still had a remarkable, especially this year has been quite remarkable for you. With 52 winners and over 16 Australian million dollars in prize money. How do you plan to build on that success in the coming season?
We buy a lot of horses each year, William.
Uh-huh. Sure.
We buy sort of 35, 40 yearlings a year,
That's quite a
and
bit, yeah.
we turn over horses a lot. I think
Okay.
one thing we do fairly well is we move horses on quite promptly when they're not making the grade. And I think that's really important. It's racing horses is a numbers game, but you've got to be ruthless
Wow.
in determining once they reach a point of judgment that if they're not going to make the grade, you've got to get rid of them, got to move them on.
You got to
And
make a very quick decision and I guess stick to it, yeah.
which is a little ironic, because
Sure,
often you can be waiting and waiting on a horse that's a slow maturer,
sure.
and then bang, after a couple of starts, you're suddenly saying, well, he's not good enough. And that's where owner expectation has got to be delicately managed, and it's something that we'd like to think we're getting better at as time goes by.
Sure. Could you share with us some insights maybe into your strategy for selecting, and developing young talents, given the success of horses like In Flight, for example?
Okay. At the yearling sales, there are 5 key factors that contribute to our buying strategy.
Okay,
Pedigree of the horse,
sure.
what type of horse they are physically.
Hmm.
Uh, they've got to get a veterinary tick. If the vet finds something amiss with them, we can't proceed.
Oh, wow.
The fourth point is the farm from which they're born and reared.
Mm.
I think that's important. And the final one, and perhaps the most important, is the price. Because you can like a lot of horses for all those aforementioned reasons,
Mhm.
but if it's too expensive, you can't
Well,
buy
that's
it.
true.
So that's our strategy per se, and that obviously we don't always end up with our top picks from a sale, because they might go beyond what we think they're worth. So we try to put price parameters on those horses that do fit the other categories, and go from there. So often we might take home our 5th seed, our 12th seed, our 20th seed, from any given sale.
Of course.
But at least we know we are buying value then.
Of course. Yeah, I feel like maybe the price is probably the most important aspect out of it, because if you can't afford it, I mean, the horse can be amazing in many different aspects. That's still an issue.
Absolutely, the price. And me as a syndicator, I'm not buying just for myself.
Sure,
I'm buying
that's
to
true.
market this to our clients and owners in general. So I've got to know that this horse has sufficient commercial appeal for owners to buy into them.
That's fair. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the Black Cloud. So he's set to step up, to black type company in spring. What are your expectations for her, and how might this impact your Everest preparations?
Okay, well, she probably won't figure in the Everest this year. Mentioned earlier, because she raced through the winter, we want to give her a light spring. So unlike Private Eye and Think About It, who had a proper spell following their autumn and early winter campaigns, the Black Cloud has just had a freshen up. So she's going to need a rest at some point in the spring. However, we'll try her in the toy show at the end of August and see how she aims up. That's her first foray into stakes company. And if she performs really well, we'll probably continue with at least one more run. But I would think that she's 12 months away from Everest company if she ever gets there.
Wow, so potentially next year then.
Possibly. She's got to keep improving a lot, as I said
Well,
earlier.
that's true. That's what you said. That's true. That's very true. You did mention also the importance, of track condition, especially, the difference between maybe spring and autumn for your horses. How do you factor this into your decision making for race placement, especially for high stakes events like the Everest?
Well, what we've decided with Private Eye is because I know he ran on a heavy track in the all-age stakes and ran third in the autumn, but he's a horse who's clearly at his best on firm ground. If Sydney has a wet spring, which it generally doesn't, but it can happen, or if it's looking like it's going to be wet on a specific day in spring that we've picked out a race for him, we can take him to Melbourne as an option. So he may end up in Melbourne, Private Eye, and so could Think About It. But Private Eye is the more experienced traveller. It's been to Melbourne previously. Think About It's travelled to Brisbane with great success.
Okay.
So, yeah, in terms of the track condition, pretty important. And if we don't get a suitable track in Sydney, we'll be forced to consider Melbourne as an alternative.
Would you say, you mentioned something interesting, you said about traveling. Would you say most of the horses you have this ability to travel easily, or there are some that are quite, difficult with that aspect of the industry, I guess, traveling, moving to other places?
Very good question, Aurelian, and ties into what I was saying earlier about how they're all different personalities.
Sure.
And some horses, like us, I suppose, they're homebodies. They don't particularly enjoy traveling.
Interesting.
The whole process of leaving their comfortable environment and the stress of standing on a float or a plane for a length of time, they don't really enjoy. So you never really find out until you try it. But Joe's method of travelling horses interstate, be it Brisbane or Melbourne, is, and this is used by a lot of trainers these days. When I was younger, you'd never consider racing a horse interstate until you gave them a couple of weeks to settle in to that new environment. These days, trainers, if a horse is racing on a Saturday, tend to travel them on the Thursday night, through the night.
Oh, wow.
So they arrive in
right before.
Yeah, the new location on the Friday morning, have an easy day on Friday,
Oh
then
my
race
God.
Saturday and prefer Sunday. Now, the thinking behind that is with the adrenaline rush of being in a new location and race day, it sort of takes settling in out of the equation because it doesn't really matter if they don't eat much or they're unsettled in the 24 hours prior.
Mhm.
Adrenaline will help them through the race. Now,
Wow.
if they were
Interesting.
going to remain there for a few weeks or something, then clearly their capacity to settle in becomes a lot more critical.
Sure.
But you see the point I'm making.
Interesting.
If the horse doesn't particularly enjoy traveling, this by racing them really quickly, that's one way of tackling that problem.
Sure. After such a successful, 2023 Everest, how did you celebrate and how do you stay motivated to aim for even greater height in 2024? That must be quite difficult.
Well, one thing I've learned about racing, Aurelian, because you lose far more often than you win, it's very important to celebrate victory, particularly big ones
Especially
like the
big
Everest. They
ones.
don't occur very often.
Sure.
We had a night with a lot of friends and some of the owners and the slot holders and Joe and his wife at a
Nice.
restaurant in Sydney,
Okay.
where quite a few drinks were consumed, uh, which was only appropriate. Uh, and no, it was a great night. And we later on we organised a lunch for all the owners to celebrate and reflect once the victory had sort of sunk in. So, yeah, I think celebration is pretty important part of racing.
For sure. How about for the horse? Any special indulgence or celebration?
Um, no,
Oh, interesting.
they're not.
No?
They're not given any champagne or any different feed,
Sure.
but they suddenly come under the microscope of receiving special care
Ah,
if they're a top class horse.
of course.
Um, the staff take special care of them and well, they care for all of the horses, obviously, but a top class horse
Yeah, extra
is
special.
going to be uh, going to receive extra attention. That's just a fact of life.
Definitely. Great. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. That was the end. That was the last question.
Aurelian, my pleasure. Anytime.